I'm Tim Bradner. Welcome to Capitol Views. And welcome Senator Cathy Gissel, President of the Senate. Welcome.
Thanks, Tim. My pleasure to be here.
Senator Gissel, what are some of the major issues that you're dealing with this spring in the session?
Well, you know, Tim, obviously our biggest issue is the budget, right? That's our constitutional required work to do. In the budget, of course, we are concerned about education, public safety, health, the cost of health, and Medicaid funding and so forth. But probably the biggest piece that we're dealing with in the budget is the question of the dividend. We have money now that's coming out of the permanent fund itself that actually exceeds the amount that is coming in through our various tax forms. So that's a switch and something we have to get used to. But the dividend is important to Alaskans. And every senator in the Alaska legislature supports continuation of that permanent fund dividend program. It is a legacy that we have here in Alaska. We want to preserve that dividend program. In doing that, we have to make sure that we protect the fund itself, out of which that dividend comes. So those earnings that come out of that fund come from various investments, and we want to make sure that that fund doesn't get depleted in the process of giving out dividends.
And for clarity, we want to say that the dividends come out of the earnings reserve. The corpus of the principal of the fund is protected.
You know, that's a complexity that a lot of Alaskans don't understand, that the permanent fund has two sections to it. Like you said, there was the corpus that cannot be touched. But then we have this smaller part of the fund called the earnings reserve account that could be spent with 50% plus one vote of the legislature. So last year, the legislature successfully executed moving $5 billion from that earnings reserve account into the corpus away from the spending opportunities for legislators to protect that money and to grow that fund. Really, you know, you'll hear us talk in the Senate a lot about growing that fund to $100 billion. Right now it's about $65 billion, right? $100 billion, it's almost an unimaginable number, but at that number, and possibly even sooner than that, it would be spinning off enough earnings that we wouldn't have to worry about what the price of oil was or what kind of fish landing fees we were getting, because it would be spinning off enough earnings to actually support state government.
As it is now.
As it is, as it's characterized now. So that's why you hear us talk so much about the size of the dividend. If we have to make excessive draws on that part of the fund that we can spend, then we actually are depleting the fund itself. We want to make sure that we protect that with a long-term view. Protecting the fact that we're giving out a dividend, but also protecting the fund itself for the long term.
And this gets into the debate as to whether we can afford to pay a full dividend or whether we can afford to pay essentially what we can afford, which is what was paid last year. And some questions I get whether that can be afforded this year, because that will in itself create a deficit. What if we were to pay the full dividend, though? That would erode the earnings reserve?
Well, in order to pay a full dividend, that's about $2 billion. To do that means that we would have a deficit of $1.5 billion. We have to get that money from somewhere. We have one last savings account, the Constitutional Budget Reserve. It has $2 billion in it. So basically what we're saying is, do we want to spend 3/4 of our last savings account? We actually heard the Commissioner of Revenue, the Acting Commissioner of Revenue, Commissioner Barnhill, speak yesterday, and he said to call the Constitutional Budget Reserve a savings account now isn't exactly accurate. It's more like a countdown clock. In other words, burning down 3/4 of that would leave us in a tremendous hole next year. It's a countdown to the end when we would have no further ability to fill budget gaps.
Now, Senator, don't we also use the Constitutional Budget Reserve as kind of a checking account? We have to pay the payroll, the utilities, the building costs, and we draw on that during the year, and then we pay it. But you need to keep money in the checkbook.
Absolutely, that's a good way to characterize it. It's kind of a buffer. So maybe the bills that come in one month are a little bit higher than that month's income. We can take a little bit out of that checkbook, cover the costs, and then put the money back in the next month. So it creates that buffer that we need throughout the year. So again, spending that down really constrains what we can do. Our budget, we are mandated to provide funding for education. We've been focused on doing that. Public safety is critical for all Alaskans, all communities across the state. We need to keep making sure we're funding that at the appropriate level. And so those are key elements that we have to keep focused on. How do we continue to fund these things, provide a dividend, but balance all of that?
And I heard an amazing thing that the dividends are very important, and since the inception of the fund, I've heard that we've paid out something like $26 billion in dividends. That's amazing.
That is amazing. Yeah. And certainly when I talk to folks in the lower 48, other legislators, they are amazed at Alaska's program.
And during most of those years, the dividends was well under $1,000.
They were. Yes, I remember a $300 dividend. In fact, in 2009, we didn't have enough money to pay a dividend. So the corporation actually took some assets and sold them. We were in a recession, and remember in the lower 48, it was that housing bubble. They actually sold assets in order to be able to pay a dividend.
Wow, that doesn't sound like a good thing to do.
It was not a good thing to do in a down market, to be selling assets.
Well, Senator, thank you for joining us, and we're out of time, but thank you for joining us at Capitol Views tonight.